Well, if they're telling you it's plus 1%, then I would say it's probably minus 5%, just because they're making up the numbers. They're the ones who gather the statistics that they then present to the rest of the world. Um, there's the Russian economy is a very sort of narrow economy. It's a resource economy, um, and I guess now it's resource plus military manufacturing economy. But there's really huge problems that they have very high inflation. They have no, I mean, they've lost a million young men to 1.2 million young men to war casualties, either death or disability, and they've lost another million men who didn't want to be in that first group who have fled the country. And so there's skills gaps all over the place in the economy. There's some huge banking crisis that's sort of bumbling under the surface because loans made by the Russian banking sector aren't being repaid. You have tax revenues which have collapsed. You have like Gazprom, for example, used to be 25% of the tax revenues of Russia. Gazprom is now a money-losing company. They're not making any money. You have the same thing happening at Rosneft, Lukoil, et cetera. It's not a good picture, and whatever they're telling you, it's much worse than what they're saying. And so I think the Russian economy is in a really pretty desperate place. But again, this is not a democracy. Putin doesn't have to run for any re-elections. He doesn't have the people be happy with him. He has to have the people be scared of him. And as long as he can have that, he can carry on in some way. I mean, look at North Korea. North Korea is an economic disaster, but they have managed for generations of Kims to repress their people. So hard to know how Russia ultimately deals with all this adversity, but the adversity is there.
Well, Donald Trump has said he's going to cut tariffs on India to around 18% after Delhi pledged to stop buying Russian oil. Let's set aside for now whether or not that will actually happen. How worried will the Kremlin be if India really does cut their oil imports from Russia?
I think that the Kremlin will be absolutely in a panic about that. I mean, if you look at how does Russia wage its war in Ukraine? It wages its war because it has an inflow of money. Where does that money come from? It comes from mostly from the sale of crude oil, from the export of crude oil from Russia. Who buys that crude oil? Three countries. China is the largest buyer, India, the second largest buyer, and Turkey, which is the third largest buyer. If you take one of those buyers out of the equation, India, that puts Russia in a very terrible place. It's not like China and Turkey can pick up the slack. And so you end up with a glut of oil. Um, and if you're, let's say you're the Chinese and you're looking at this situation, you say, you know what, I want a 25% discount on my oil now because we know you're in a weak position. And so if you actually look at the price that Russia is getting per barrel of oil right now, even before this has happened, it's dramatically lower than the international price of Brent crude oil. And so what it means is that Russia gets less money. And the calculations that I've read over the last couple of days is that their revenue from the sale of oil is down 50% from a year ago. And that means that they're going to be in trouble, in economic trouble. And that's good. That's good for Ukraine, and that's good for a potential negotiation at some point, because the only way that Russia's ever going to stop this war is when they're forced to. And the only way they're going to be forced to is if they can't afford it. And this is a good step in that direction.
We have had these sort of pledges beforehand from India and from the US, though, Bill, haven't we? How likely is this to really go ahead and go into effect and not be a kind of shuffling of refineries that we've seen in the past?
Well, it's not just the United States that's a player here. So the European Union is also a player, and one shouldn't underestimate the European Union. The European Union is an economic bloc that's about 80% as big as the United States in terms of its economic power to force countries to obey sanctions and so on. You've got the UK, you've got other countries. And the way I understand it is that in India, these are private businesses. So these are businesses owned by families, these refineries. and they have a lot of other business interests. And the last thing they want to do is be sort of rogue operators where whether it's in relation to the Europeans or the Americans or whomever. And so they're all sort of tiptoeing around this even before this decision was made, which is why the price of oil is down so much for the Russians. And so, I mean, I think it's all very helpful. Now, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, you're right. We don't know what he's going to do. Everything he's done up until now has been sporadic, inconsistent, malign in many cases. And so I think we all we have to do is say that um, something is happening. The Indians um, are definitely not feeling emboldened by this move. They're probably wondering themselves what it means, uh, and we just have to see. But what I can say is that the proof is in the numbers, and the numbers are that Russia's oil revenues from a year ago till now are down 50%, and that's a good thing.
And you mentioned some of the other purchases of Russian oil. Who should be next, and how should the US and the EU, if they are feeling more confident, go about bringing that 50% down even further?
It's very simple. There's two oil refineries in China that are the biggest consumers of Russian oil. If they were to stop consuming Russian oil, that would be the end of the story for Vladimir Putin. Um, and it's not as if we have to say to the Chinese, we're going to launch a trade war against your country. We just say that these two refineries are going to not be welcome in the Western world to sell their refined product, to buy, to use banking services, to insure themselves, to dock in our ports or whatever, if they buy Russian oil. And if we were to have the guts to do that, I think that's the end of the story for Vladimir Putin. And for what it's worth, I mean, that's what he's been desperately trying to avoid, because he knows that his lifeline is money. He needs that money to pay for soldiers and weapons and so on. And if that money dries up, he's finished.
And talking about some of these pressures on the Russian oil economy at the moment, there is a sort of wider crackdown we've seen going on. The US seizing several tankers since the start of this year, which seems to have set a precedent because we've heard about the French also seizing tankers now. Um, is this going to be? How is this going to be adding to Russia's concerns about being able to get this oil abroad?
Very much so. I mean, I should point out that the U.S. is seizing Russian tankers not as a policy towards Russia. The U.S. hasn't seized any Russian tankers because it's upset with Russia exporting oil. The U.S. has seized Russian tankers because they were involved in exporting oil from the Maduro regime from Venezuela, and so it just so happened that they were Russian tankers, but it's not a policy towards Russia. Um, Having said that, as you mentioned, uh, the French grabbed a Russian tanker, and let's not forget that the Ukrainians are imposing their own sanctions on the Shadow Fleet. As far as I'm aware, somewhere around four, maybe five tankers have either been blown up or decapacitated or incapacitated, I should say. Um, and so, I mean, it's not a good time to be a, a, a skipper of a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker. You could end up, being a casualty of war, and I think that's how the Ukrainians view it. And so, from all different perspectives, the noose is tightening, and it's kind of a shame that we've had this much time pass before everyone's figured this out, because the noose could have been tightening 2 years ago, and you have a lot less dead Ukrainian civilians. You'd have a lot less uh, suffering among the Ukrainian population, because the Russians have been bombing them into absolute fear and freezing temperatures and so on. But better late than never.